1972 was the year of the Munich Olympics and of Pong, the first video game. It was the year of Elton John's Rocket Man. On the roads, France gave us the Renault 5 and Germany the Mercedes S-Class. British Leyland introduced the Triumph Dolomite. In Formula 1, the reigning world champion was Jackie Stewart. It was his second world title using the superb Ford Cosworth engine. This off-the-peg power unit had transformed Grand Prix racing by enabling small teams to build their own cars around the Ford-sponsored V8. Teams like Ferrari, BRM and Matra Simca were racing using their own engines, but were finding it hard going against the Ford-powered competition. As the teams lined up in Buenos Aires for the first Grand Prix of the new season, there were new faces among the familiar stars like Stewart, Hulme, Hill and Ickx. Along with new teams and new cars came new sponsors. Lotus had started the sports romance with tobacco by adopting the colours of gold leaf cigarettes. But for 1972, there were new colours and a new name. The cars were no longer Lotuses, they were John Player Specials. There was another new cigarette sponsor at BRM, whose cars now carried a name that was to become a dominant element in Formula 1, Marlboro. It was only 4 years earlier that the first sponsor stickers had appeared on cars that were still mainly painted in national racing colours. Now those colours had almost all disappeared. Only the proud red Ferraris still carried the colour that denoted their nationality. Peter Revson was starting his first full season in Formula 1 with Yardley McLaren. Jackie Stewart was entering his 8th, while Chris Amon entered F1 in 1963. Emerson Fittipaldi, with new teammate Dave Walker, had led the Lotus team since the death of Jochen Rindt in 1970. Australian Tim Schenken had moved from Brabham to Surtees, while Peter Gethin was in his second season with BRM. Also with BRM were Austria's Helmut Marko and Sweden's Rainer Wiesel. Among the cars taking to the track in Argentina, the class of the field was reckoned to be the Tyrrell. In its first season of racing, the car had proved fast enough and reliable enough to give Jackie Stewart the championship, and there was no reason that driver and car should not repeat the success. The Ferraris were a threat, and with Jackie Ickx, Clay Regazzoni and Mario Andretti driving, the red cars were always potential winners. BRM was an unknown quantity, for its lavish new sponsorship meant the British team was running 5 cars. Maybe that was too many. The big question mark was over Lotus. Colin Chapman and the team had been hit hard by Jochen Rindt's death in 1970, and 1971 had been an unsuccessful year. But the Lotus 72 was a superb design, and Chapman could never be counted out. At the end of practice, however, it was Reutemann's Brabham on pole, an amazing performance by the local driver in his first Grand Prix. He led Stewart and the McLarens of Revson and Hulme. Fittipaldi's John Player Special was next, and then came Regazzoni's Ferrari. As the flag dropped to signal the end of practice, there was an interesting race in progress. As the crowd and the drivers anticipated the start, the talk was of Reutemann's pole position. One of the contributing factors had been the special qualifying tyres Goodyear had provided. They gave exceptional grip, but only lasted for a few laps. As the season progressed, they were to become an important element in the sport. As the flag fell, Stewart and Reutemann battled for the lead. The Scot came out on top, for the Argentinian had started on his qualifying tyres, hoping that they would last. They didn't, and after 6 laps he had to stop to change them. Behind Stewart, Hulme and Regazzoni were chasing Fittipaldi, who was pressing the Tyrrell hard. On lap 20, Ferrari chief engineer Mauro Foghieri's day was spoiled when Andretti pulled into the pits to retire with a misfiring engine. Teammates Regazzoni and Ickx were still running, but all eyes were on Fittipaldi, who was right on Stewart's tail. But the Brazilian's Lotus had damaged its suspension at the start, and with just under a third of the race to run, he had to retire. Graham Hill was also out, watching from the pits as Stewart pulled away from home. At the flag, the Scot was almost half a minute ahead of the McLaren, which in turn was half a minute ahead of third man Ickx. For the reigning champion and the Tyrrell team, it was a good start to the season. The second race of the year was at Kyalami near Johannesburg in South Africa. As usual, the African sun shone brightly and the circuit, one of the more relaxed venues on the Grand Prix programme, gave the drivers and teams a friendly welcome. 2 months had passed since the race in Argentina, but there were no great technical changes in the cars. Various teams, including BRM, Brabham, March and Tyrrell, were working on new cars, but none of them were ready for the long trek to the Highveld. Designers prefer to have the first race with a new car relatively close to home in case something goes wrong and an overnight dash back home to the workshops required. So Jackie Stewart and the rest of the drivers were settling into familiar cockpits as they made the last-minute preparations before going out onto the track for practice. Stewart's car carried the number 1T. 1 marked his status as world champion, while the T meant the car was his spare and its times would not be counted for qualifying. Carlos Reutemann, in only his second Grand Prix, could only dream of having a spare car, but his time would come, as would Mario Andretti's. One area where development was evident was tyres. Competition between Goodyear and Firestone was fierce, and they brought hundreds of tyres to each race. Francois Sever was beginning his third year with Tyrrell and was proving an excellent backup to Stewart. For reasons of economy, Chris Amon was Matra Simca's sole driver this year. The poleman in Argentina, Reutemann was confident in his Brabham. Mario Andretti was fulfilling a boyhood dream to drive for Ferrari. Henri Pescarolo's March team was managed by Frank Williams, operating as usual on the thinnest of budgets. Graham Hill hadn't had much success since winning the title in '68, but hopes were high for the Brabham team under new owner Bernie Eccleston. As practice started and the cars dived out of the pits onto Kyalami's start and finish straight, the first task was to clear the racing line around the circuit. The Johannesburg track was used less frequently than some of the European circuits, and its exposed position allowed the wind to blow dust onto it. In the first day's practice, the cars would clear the dust and lay down a coating of rubber that would create the grip they needed. In the meantime, the lack of grip encouraged the drivers to hang the tail out occasionally. It was easy to tell who was trying hardest. As the track settled down, the qualifying pattern began to establish itself. Jackie Stewart was fastest, taking pole 0.3 of a second ahead of Clay Regazzoni's Ferrari. Behind the Swiss driver, things were crowded. Fittipaldi, Hailwood and Holm all recorded the same time, just 0.1 of a second slower than Regazzoni. Andretti was another 10th behind the trio, while Ickx and Sever fill the rest of the third row. Because of the width of the Kyalami straight, there was room for 3 cars side by side on the front row of the grid. There were 2 on the second, and this 3-2 sequence continued to the back. That's where you'd find the oddest looking car in the field, the Eiffel Land March driven by Rolf Stommelen. With its rear view mirror mounted centrally in front of the cockpit, it earned some strange looks from the other drivers. Race day arrived with typical Kyalami weather, clear skies and very high temperatures. Hot weather and the track's altitude meant the cars would be a little down on power, but everyone had the same disadvantage, so the competition promised to be as hot as the sunshine. But the sun hadn't affected only the engines. Seconds after the flag dropped, some idiot decided to run across the track. Fortunately, the man's stupidity had no effect on the leading drivers, and the race was able to continue. Denny Hulme had seized the advantage at the start, but as the field came past on its second lap, Stewart eased the Tyrrell past the New Zealander's McLaren and set off to establish a lead. Behind Stewart, Hulme, Fittipaldi and Hailwood were locked in a fierce battle, which saw Hailwood come out on top until his rear suspension let him down. Then, just after the halfway mark, the Tyrrell's gearbox seized and Jackie was a spectator in the pits, along with Carlos Reutemann. McLaren team manager Teddy Mayer's African Safari was to bring back a good bag. A win for Denny Hulme and third place for Peter Revson in the second Yardley McLaren. More importantly, Hulme's 9 championship points put the New Zealander ahead of Stewart and Fittipaldi in the race for the world title. And so the Grand Prix circus moved to Europe and the Jarama circuit near Madrid in Spain. The form book was now a little clearer. Stewart was still a major contender, but other teams like the Surtees outfit with Mike Hailwood had made progress. Frank Williams Politoy's March team with Pache and Pescarolo and less experienced drivers like Australian Dave Walker at Lotus were at a disadvantage. But up at the front of the grid, where Jackie Stewart and Mario Andretti hung out, a pecking order was beginning to establish itself. Chris Amon's Matra still wasn't reliable, while Jean-Pierre Beltoise was settling in at BRM. King Juan Carlos of Spain enjoys motor racing, and for once, Louis and Jean Stanley, the royal family of BRM in the 60s and 70s, were outranked by the real thing as the King met the drivers, with a special greeting going to famous former driver Baron de Graffenried. Ron Toranak of Brabham and Colin Chapman of Lotus had both been major influences on Formula 1 design, but Toranak, unhappy under Brabham's new ownership, was soon to leave the team. The weather was cold and grey as the grid lined up in the 3-2-3 formation as they had at Kyalami. On the front row were Ickx, Hulme and Fittipaldi, and behind them were Stewart and Andretti. Stewart took the initiative at the start and grabbed first place, but on lap 8, Fittipaldi slipped past into the lead. He was followed by Ickx, Hulme, Regazzoni, Andretti. Then came Wiesel, Amon, Diadamic, Wilson Fittipaldi, Hailwood, Revson, Sever, Schenken, Ganley, Stommelen, Pescarolo, Pache, and finally Peterson. Local star Alex Soler-Roig in a BRM was the first of many drivers to spin off. Fittipaldi was uncatchable, as Stewart, Ickx and Hull battled over second place. But the Ferrari was now lighter than during the earlier races, and the Belgian had an advantage. Before the race, it had looked like rain, and Stewart and Ickx had bet on it, taking soft tyres. Fittipaldi was better equipped for a dry race, and when rain fell around midway, it looked as though his rivals would have an advantage. But it was only a shower, and as the track dried, the Brazilians stayed ahead. At the finish, the flags were being prepared to signal Emerson Fittipaldi's second Grand Prix victory. Technically speaking, this was the first win for a John Player special, but few would call it anything but the 43rd for a Lotus. And so the championship trail moved on to the richest corner of the Mediterranean, settling alongside the harbour in Monaco. The Monaco Grand Prix was always a social event, but in the 1960s it had become a media event too. In the days when Formula 1 still had to fight for TV time, the Monaco race was one that always got worldwide exposure, which attracted even more of the beautiful people like skiing star Jean-Claude Killy. François Sévère's film star looks made him at home in Monaco, but as Beltoise and Gethin of BRM found out, so long as you were a driver, you didn't have to look like Steve McQueen. Reutemann was injured, so Wilson Fittipaldi was in his second race for Brabham. Another newcomer was Britain's Brian Redman, driving for McLaren, while Revson raced at Indianapolis. In the days before standardised race weekend timetables, practice at Monaco was always a rushed affair. Talking over the car's setup with the mechanics was a vital element.
You tell me one lap of it, I hit 10.
No, you're alright to that. You've got new pads.
The track at Monaco is totally unique. It's a throwback to the 1920s, when races ran through city streets to demonstrate the speed and excitement of cars that were only available to the privileged few. The first Monaco Grand Prix was run in 1929, and the circuit of 1972 was exactly the same, starting on the harbour front, climbing up to the heights of Monte Carlo, and then snaking down through this section to run back through the tunnel and alongside the sea to return to the harbour. This corner used to be the station hairpin, but in 1972 the station had gone. It was just the building site on which next year another new hotel would stand. With practice over, Fittipaldi was on pole ahead of Ickx. Regazzoni's Ferrari was next, followed by Beltoise in his BRM. On race day, however, he and the rest of Monaco woke up to pouring rain. But for him, it was to be the brightest day of his life. Controlling the V12's power superbly, he took the lead from the start and dominated the race. Behind him, every other driver had to drive into a curtain of spray that obscured everything. The spray only fell back on the slowest parts of the course, like the old station hairpin. But on these corners, there was always the danger of applying too much power too soon and spinning off. The last thing the drivers needed now was the oil flag, as if the surface wasn't slippery enough. Through it all, Beltoise drove fast but carefully, knowing that because overtaking is so difficult, the leader at Monaco always has the advantage. It wasn't all gentlemanly, however, as he explained after the race.
He was on my way. It was impossible to overtake, you see. So that was the only way to overtake him, was to touch him.
You pushed him over to the side.
Yes.
The victim of the push, Schenken in the Surtees. Behind Beltoise, wet weather specialists Ickx and Stewart struggled to keep up, and the whole field fought against an excess of power for the conditions. Even Jackie Stewart had a spin, but mercifully not in front of the cameras. Mike Beutler wasn't so lucky, and even the winner had his hairy moments. The 1971 race in dry conditions had lasted just 8 minutes under the 2-hour mark. This one was to last 2 hours and 27 minutes, all but 5.3 seconds. But as the final laps reeled off, Louis Stanley of BRM could smile in anticipation of a champagne celebration. This was to be Jean-Pierre Beltoir's only Grand Prix win, but it would go down among the truly historic driving performances. Fittipaldi took third from Stewart with just 4 laps to go. This put the Brazilian on top of the championship table, ahead of Ickx, whose second place here moved him above Hulme and Stewart as the series moved on to Belgium and the new Nivelles circuit near Brussels. Championship leader Emerson Fittipaldi had good reason to smile, but Graham Hill's results were disappointing. There was time for picnic lunches and playtime with the press, but if BRM designer Tony Southgate was looking for new ideas, it's unlikely he would be taking them from the shape of Rolf Stommelen's Eifelland March. As the cars went out for first practice under the guidance of enthusiastic local marshals, there was one notable absentee. Jackie Stewart had been diagnosed with a stomach ulcer. The Tyrrell team was down to 1 car and Francois Sever. On his home ground and second in the championship, it was expected that Jackie Ickx would be a contender for pole position. He was a contender certainly, but he couldn't make the front line of 3 cars. That was made up of Fittipaldi and Regazzoni, who shared the fastest time, and Hulme. Ickx was on line 2 alongside Sever, receiving all the attentions of the Tyrrell team and repaying their efforts. On the evidence of practice, however, this was going to be a battle between Ferrari and Lotus. Emerson Fittipaldi was quick in practice and he knew how to win a race, but he still hadn't mastered the art of starting, and as the cars raced away from the grid, he lost out to Regazzoni. The Swiss led for 9 laps, but Emerson stuck with him and slipped past just as soon as an opportunity presented itself. Behind him, Regazzoni clung on, but Hulme, troubled by a vibration in his front wheels, was unable to make any impression. Ickx's engine was out of sorts, and that left Sever sticking with the leaders and moving up as their problems struck. Lotus boss Colin Chapman could trust Fittipaldi to do the job right, helped on his way by the retirement of rivals like Ickx, whose fuel injection system had let him down. Another retirement was that of the new Techno, making its first race appearance in the hands of Nanni Galli. A collision with Regazzoni put both the Techno and the Ferrari out of the race. Fittipaldi had dominated the race, and when the flag fell, he was almost half a second ahead of Sever. Half a minute further back was Denny Hulme. On the podium, Emerson's smile was outshone only by that of Francois Sever, who could be pleased with the way he had performed while the boss was off sick. Jackie Stewart wouldn't be too happy, however. Both Fittipaldi and Hulme had extended the gap between him and the top championship positions. The French Grand Prix was held on the road circuit at Clermont-Ferrand. Jackie Stewart had recovered from his ulcer, and the big news was that the Tyrrell team had a new car which Sever would drive. There was also a third Lotus driven by South African David Charlton, but it failed to qualify. Stewart's plan was to rely on his knowledge of the circuit to keep him competitive in the older car.
Why don't we do one turn? It's the only way I can feel it. It's okay, the gear change is still bad even though I do it slowly.
The teams were all discussing tactics for a circuit based on public roads, a format that required them to get used to a crowded pit lane, as Nicky Lauda was to find out. At least the visitors, like veteran British driver Raymond Mays, could get close to the action. Keeping an eye on the action behind him was Chris Amon. He had a new, lighter Matra this weekend, so new the mirrors hadn't been fitted yet. On the track, the tight corner just before the pits saw plenty of embarrassed drivers. But no one was more embarrassed than Francois Sever, who spun and bent the brand new Tyrrell and then had to explain himself to the team owner. Francois thought it was a mechanical problem. Ken didn't.
One wishbone is bad.
In the older Tyrrell, Stewart was going well, but he was his usual analytical self, always wanting to do better.
Yeah, I think so. I've got a back-end problem when I get out of the corner, but the biggest problem is pointing the car. I can't point the car in all these corners going down the hill. The car's gliding over the road rather than biting into it.
The start, with Eamon and Hulme in an all-Kiwi front row, Stewart and Ickx behind. But watch the red car on the right. It's the March driven by Ronnie Peterson. Eamon had qualified 0.8 of a second faster than Hulme and over 1.5 seconds faster than Stewart. The new Matra was obviously very good and he had no problems keeping ahead of the chasing pair. Clermont-Ferrand is the home of Michelin tyres, but in 1972 the company had no interest in Grand Prix racing. This meant that the big money battle between the American giants of Goodyear and Firestone was taking place in the backyard of their biggest commercial competitor. This year Goodyear, with the first 3 cars, was ahead, while Ickx was the leading Firestone runner. The French company was just an interested observer, but it wouldn't stay that way. Then tyres began to play a major part in the race. Walker's retirement of the second Lotus was mechanical, but other cars all suffered punctures. Eamon was first, then in came Hulme, followed by Patrick Depailler in his first Grand Prix with Tyrrell. The punctures were caused by sharp stones from the edges of the track, and after Ickx also became a victim, the Tyrrell pit warned Stewart, now in the lead, of the danger. Driving precisely to avoid damaging his tyres, Stewart held his lead to the flag, keeping ahead of Fittipaldi and somehow, it seems, causing the official with the flag a degree of unhappiness. As Jackie was welcomed by a cheering crowd and showers of champagne, there were many in the pits feeling sympathy for Chris Amon. The unluckiest man in racing drove back through the field after his puncture to finish third, but a trip in a Rolls-Royce was no consolation for losing an almost certain win. Ten years ago, in 1962, the British Grand Prix was held at Aintree near Liverpool, but ever since the race had alternated between Silverstone and Brands Hatch, and this was the 5th Grand Prix on the Kentish circuit. For Chris Amon and the Matra team, The performance in France had been encouraging, and they were hoping to go well on a circuit that, like Clermont-Ferrand, was full of ups and downs, but it had a better surface and tyre problems should be minimal. With 34 out of a possible 45 points in the first half of the season, Fittipaldi was firmly placed at the top of the World Championship. For the Brazilian, the only real challenge was from Jackie Stewart, for Denny Hulme had been involved in a crash while racing in the Can-Am series in America. He wasn't injured, but he was off form, and this weekend would be no threat to Fittipaldi's championship hopes. Stewart's chances were bolstered by the new Tyrrell 005. It had been fast in the hands of Sévère in France, and now it was the chance for the team's lead driver to test its possibilities. In 1972, ventilated brake discs were the latest thing on Grand Prix cars. Today, they are the norm on family saloons, proof that racing improves the breed. But electronically, the F1 cars of the 70s are like dinosaurs. Then, electronics meant ignition and fuel injection, and that was all. Today, electronics are everywhere. A luxury car's computing power makes a Lotus 72 look like a PC against a supercomputer. The pattern of practice was broken as Jackie Stewart walked back to the pits. The new 005 had done the same thing to him as it had to François Sévère in France. Snapped out of control without warning. For Jackie, it was back to the old car. For the Tyrrell design team, it was back to the drawing board. There were also problems for Eamon and the Matra engineers, with a damaged suspension arm. Back in his old Tyrrell 003, Stewart was fast enough for fourth on the grid behind Revson and Fittipaldi. But as the band played during the build-up to the start, the talk was about the speed of poleman Jackie Ickx in his Ferrari. And sure enough, when the flag fell, it was the red car that streaked into the lead, ahead of Fittipaldi and Beltoise, who'd shot through to get ahead of Stewart. Behind them, the field snaked through Paddock Bend and up the hill to Druids Bend before diving down behind the pits. Then it was off into the back country of Brands Hatch, the loop that had been added to the circuit to turn it into a track long enough to host a Grand Prix. The original kidney-shaped Brands Hatch track was still there, and it still hosted national races, even one at Christmas. The secret of the appeal of Brands was the superb view spectators got from practically any point on the circuit. There were big grandstands along the pit straight, and the car park on the slope behind the pits offered fans the opportunity to watch the racing from their own cars. The fanfare their horns produced to salute winners was one of the unique features of the circuit. Finally, Stewart managed to get past Beltoise, but he was a long way behind the leading pair, which was dominated by Ickx. Then, with 2/3 of the race run, the Ferrari suffered an oil leak and was forced to retire. The flag, it was another victory for Emerson Fittipaldi. But during the latter stages of the race, Stewart had caught up with him, and he had to fight every inch of the way. Revson, who finished third, was over a minute behind. The post-race celebrations were not just for the win. Although Stewart, Hulme and Ickx all had a theoretical chance of taking the championship, Fittipaldi's grip on the title was tightening. He'd scored points in 6 out of the 7 races run so far, and he had won 3 of them. Beating him would be difficult. The Grand Prix at the original Nürburgring used to have 100,000 spectators, but there were parts where no spectators were allowed. Only film could give us this view. Only the drivers got a better view, but it's unlikely they were able to appreciate it as they sped through over 14 miles with 89 left-hand and 85 right-hand corners that needed thousands of gear changes in the course of a Grand Prix. In 1972, the ring belonged to Jackie Ickx and his Ferrari. His pole time was a second faster than that of Jackie Stewart in second place and 2.9 seconds faster than Fittipaldi in third. As the Belgian led away from the start, he took a lead he was never to give up. Behind Ickx, the battle was between Fittipaldi and Regazzoni. Stewart, who'd been squeezed out at the start, was fourth, but fighting back. Ronnie Peterson, in a march that was at last worthy of his talent, was also in contention. The long straight of the Nürburgring runs parallel to the main road from Koblenz to Aachen, and just a short distance away to the right of the picture, everyday traffic was travelling at less than a third of the speed of the Grand Prix cars. Ickx's Ferrari was in superb tune, and he was matching the car with driving skill that had been honed in long-distance sports car races on this circuit. He was gaining around 3 seconds a lap on his pursuers, smashing Sever's lap record set the previous year by almost 7 seconds. He covered the 14.2 miles in 7 minutes and 13.6 seconds, an average of almost 118 miles an hour. For the purists, this was motor racing at its best.
A report that Fittipaldi's car is smoking.
Then, on the 10th of the 14 laps, Fittipaldi's gearbox seized and he caught fire right behind the pits. For the first time since Argentina in January, the JPS had suffered a mechanical failure. The toughest course in Grand Prix racing was beginning to take its toll. The battery on Beltoir's BRM was hanging loose, earning him the black flag, and the timekeepers were beginning to lose cars from their lap charts. Now was the time for the mechanics to earn their pay. The BRM boys fixed Beltoirs' car, and the Tyrrell team got Francois Sever back into the race. In the Williams pit, Carlos Pache had a longer stop, but he still rejoined the battle. Although fixing his visor cost valuable seconds. In the Tyrrell pit, Helen Stewart was watching her husband coming to grips with Regazzoni in the Ferrari in the battle for second place behind Ickx. It was no holds barred. And then, on the very last lap, the two cars tangled. The Tyrrell went off the track and destroyed its suspension against the barriers. There was no doubt about who Jackie blamed for the incident. For Ferrari, first and second was a great result, and the team was justifiably jubilant. Ronnie Peterson and March could be happy with third too, but the big loser was Jackie Stewart. To lose second place in a race where his greatest rival had retired was a bitter blow to his championship hopes. To see Regazzoni, the man he blamed for his retirement, on the podium in the place that could have been his, must have made it worse. On to the picturesque Austrian countryside and the Österreich ring at Zeltweg. For Ronnie Peterson, the work of the March engineers was beginning to pay off. But Tim Schenken was perhaps considering an alternative career, while Carlos Pache was having to work hard at Williams. But they all had it easy compared with the fledgling Connu team. Driven by Francois Migaud, the car was designed by Peter Connu, formerly with Surtees. Hopelessly underfunded, this was to be its only Grand Prix appearance. But at least it showed that a small team could play on the same playing field as the big boys. Unfortunately for the little guys, the big boys' toys were much more expensive. For a team like Konu to mix with the likes of Tyrrell, Lotus, Brabham and Ferrari needed a special kind of talent and a healthy slice of determination. Unlike today's qualifying, practice in the 1970s was not all about flying around the track. More time was available in those days, so conferences, consultations and just plain old conversations were going on all along pit lane as drivers, mechanics, managers and engineers worked on problems, discussed tactics or just chatted with their mates. As the cars headed out to practice, working up to maximum speed on this, one of the fastest Grand Prix circuits, it was once again an example of the gap between the front of the grid and those further down who exist to a large degree on hope. Mike Beutler, in a March bankroll by a group of British stockbrokers, was in his 7th race of the year. His final points tally would be 0. Graham Hill wasn't doing much better. So far, he'd scored just 2 points. Jackie Stewart, 4th on the grid, had got a Goodyear cowboy hat, but Jochen Rindt's widow Nina looked a lot smarter in hers. After practice, Gethin and Ganley can chat. Emerson Fittipaldi gets over simple questions from the press.
You had bad luck at Nürburgring. What happened there?
Oh, I had a problem with the gearbox. Start jump out of gear and then broke the gearbox.
You feel you're still going to win the World Championship?
Oh, it's still a long way to go, you know, but we have to try.
You've got 43 points. Who's in second place now?
It's Jackie.
Yeah.
Jack Stewart and Jack Hicks, they are very close, you know. I think still a long way to go. I prefer to wait.
Emerson may prefer to wait, but the starter waits for nobody as the grid, led by Regazzoni, moves up to the line ready to be unleashed. The Swiss driver was caught out at the start and lost his pole position advantage. Stewart was able to get past him, and after the problems he'd had with the Ferrari driver at the Nürburgring, he was no doubt keen to open up as big a gap as possible. Fittipaldi took longer to get past Regazzoni, but he managed it in the end, and after 10 laps, Stewart, Fittipaldi and Hulme were running 1, 2, 3, and Regazzoni was on the verge of retirement with a fuel feed problem. Fittipaldi was on top form, and on lap 23 he outbraked Stewart and passed him. The Tyrrell's handling was deteriorating, and Stewart knew that he couldn't catch the Lotus. If Fittipaldi won, the title would be almost in his hands. Thinking tactically, Stewart decided not to hold up Hulme, who might be able to beat the young Brazilian. The New Zealander took up the chase, but to no avail. He could only manage second ahead of Revson. Stewart, fighting handling problems that got worse as the race progressed, slipped back to finish 7th. As Fittipaldi and the Lotus disappeared beneath a mass of supporters at the finish, one phrase was heard again and again: 35 points ahead. Barring accidents, Emerson was now unbeatable in the title race. Jackie Stewart arrives at Monza by helicopter, but for BRM drivers Peter Gethin and Howden Ganley, the transport is a hire car driven by Gethin, who won here in 1971. The atmosphere is light-hearted.
You guys feel at all nervous before a race like that?
Nervous? Nervous? Race? There's a race today.
We're just going to the beach, aren't we?
I think you do feel nervous, but not any more so than, you get used to it. I think every week you're doing it. You're not so much nervous as trying to work out what you're going to do, what you're not going to do.
Okay, we're just going to get a medical done.
Arriving in the paddock, drivers greet their friends. For Jackie Stewart, it's Tyrrell designer Derek Gardner. Emerson Fittipaldi finds sports car race Vic Elford with his wife and Goodyear's racing boss. And when characters like Graham Hill and Mike Halewood meet up, there's always a joke.
Yeah, I know, it's what, tacky old clothes, times are rough.
As the cars lined up, Eakes was on pole with Eamon second. Stewart, back in the new 005, was third. But his championship hopes were about to die. Watch his car on the right-hand side of the second row. Fortunately, nobody hit the Tyrrell as it staggered off the line with a broken clutch, and Jackie was able to wave to a sympathetic crowd. But now he knew that Fittipaldi's title had gone from a strong possibility to a certainty. The crowd may have been sympathetic to Stewart, but with Ickx leading Regazzoni, the prancing horse was rampant, and the Scots' departure was soon forgotten in a rush of Italian pride. Fittipaldi, Eamon, Halewood and Holm were following the two Ferraris, but only Fittipaldi's car could stand the pace as the others dropped out with mechanical problems. With some lurid spins and Ferraris in the lead, the early part of the race had plenty to keep the Italian fans interested, even though it was being run on a circuit with new chicanes to reduce top speeds. But then things began to go wrong for the home team. Regazzoni was eliminated when he hit Carlos Pace. Mario Andretti suffered a puncture, and Jackie Ickx dropped out of first place with an ignition problem with just 10 laps to go. And the man who inherited the lead, Emerson Fittipaldi. In another example of his driving skill and the car's reliability, he thundered home to his 5th Grand Prix victory of the year and the world title. Colin Chapman threw his hat in the air and the Italian crowd invaded the track. There's no better place to win a world championship than at Monza. It's a mecca of motor racing and it treats its champions with adulation and devotion. For the 25-year-old Fittipaldi and his wife, it must have been unforgettable. Five wins in 10 races and only 2 races in which he didn't score points. Fittipaldi's season had been worthy of a true champion, and the John Player Lotus had proved a true champion car. With the championship decided, the Canadian Grand Prix was all about individual results. Stewart and Holm needed to prove that as past champions, they had not lost their touch. Fittipaldi wanted to prove he was a worthy champion. With the Tyrrell 005 finally sorted, it was the Scotsman that came out on top, by a long way. The car behaved perfectly, and he pulled steadily away from his pursuers. At the finish, he was 48 seconds ahead of Revson, with Holm third. Fittipaldi finished 11th after a collision and a pit stop. Now that the championship was his, the Brazilian finally decided to show he was human, as did Jackie Stewart when faced by the race queen. The final race of the year in the traditional autumnal surroundings of Watkins Glen in upstate New York. For the Tyrrell team, there was plenty of reason for confidence. The 005 had proved itself, and now Sever had one too. Things looked good for 1973. Fittipaldi could look forward confidently as well. The Lotus JPS was still the car others were judged by. Stewart was on pole and shared the front row of the grid with the 2 McLarens, but Fittipaldi was back on row 4. The race was run in bright sunshine, but as usual at Watkins Glen, it was cold and a stiff breeze was blowing the colourful leaves from the trees. Cold conditions make it difficult for the tyre technicians, for cold tyres don't work as well as they should. In this race, it was the Goodyears that had the best performance and the Firestone runners were at a disadvantage. The company's two fastest runners, Regazzoni and Fittipaldi, were 6th and 9th on the grid. It was no surprise, therefore, that Goodyear dominated the race. For Stewart, it was a perfect afternoon, for he led from start to finish. To confirm the performance of the new Tyrrell, Francois Sever, 4th on the grid, was in a secure 2nd place, while Denny Hulme was lying 3rd. These positions would enable Tyrrell to beat McLaren to 2nd place in the Constructors' Championship. The new champion's North American bad luck continued when he retired with handling problems, but Ronnie Peterson, who would be his teammate next year, was 4th. As the flamboyant Watkins Glen flagman signalled the end of the race, Jackie Stewart shared the congratulations and the podium with his wife, his teammate and his team manager. He could look forward to the next season, but 1972 belonged to Emerson Fittipaldi. Fittipaldi's win in the 1972 championship showed that Lotus, whatever it might be called for the benefit of the sponsors, was an organisation capable of producing great racing cars and finding the best men to drive them. It also showed that the Tyrrell operation, coupled with the driving talents of Jackie Stewart, could take on the world and win. For the traditionalists, it showed that Ferrari could never be counted out.